Okay, thanks, Jack. You can hear me? Right. And good morning, very morning for the people from the United States. Very early morning. Good morning to people here in the Belgium time zone, and then probably many of our participants are already in the afternoon. Good afternoon to you. Yes, so let me just set my time. I would like to, I think if I remember correctly, Jack asked that this last lecture also be somewhat of a looking forward. I'm not sure how much of that I'm able to do, but I am going to try a bit of it. But yes, it is about matter and spirit, and I'll try and explain to you how and why. So in 2023, Piotr Blumczynski wrote this really fascinating monograph, Experiencing Translationality, in which he argued that translation is firstly a material practice, and he shows historical data for this, how relics were translated, carried over from place to place, and with that some meaning came. And he would argue that stuff, sometimes bodies, sometimes he has examples of trinkets, he has examples of guitars, that stuff is indeed sometimes carried over. So on the one hand, in translation studies, we have this growing interest in materiality and in figuring out the material basis of what we are talking about when we're talking about translation. A year later, Salabo Salama wrote a book, A Bergsonian Approach to Translation and Time, towards spiritual translation studies. And Salama takes the exact opposite view, and he actually criticizes Blumczynski and my work, which he puts in the same category, quite heavily. And he say, well, actually, translation should be a spiritual practice. And he uses Bergson's ideas about intuition, and that in the moment of experience, you can have direct contact with a deity or with a spiritual, not necessarily a deity, with a spiritual truth or a spiritual experience, and that you do not need mediation or semiosis or materiality to explain this. So Blumczynski says matter becomes meaningful. Salama says meaning or spirit becomes material over time. So for me, the question here is not who is right and who's wrong. But I think they put their fingers on the kind of problem that I've been trying to deal with over the past 2 weeks, and that is, can we find a conceptual framework to explain both matter and energy and idea or spirit or any other similarities within one framework? We have these binaries like brain and mind, nature and culture, body and mind. And it is really difficult, and many people have tried before to synthesize these positions. And I don't think I solved the problem, but I hope maybe to contribute a bit to the debate. So here goes. First, I want to make a number of points of departure, because this debate obviously is situated within much larger debates, and you need to make a number of assumptions. No debate can ever be made without assumptions. No argument can be made without assumptions. So I want to be upfront about my assumptions. So firstly, I have two caveats. Obviously, the first one, obviously, the cosmology that you follow will inform how you think about matter and spirit. if you think, let's say, from a religious perspective, you will see a certain relationship between spirit and matter. If you think from a purely scientific perspective, you will see a different relationship. If you have animist views of reality, you would probably come up with another kind of explanation. So I want to be upfront. At this point, my cosmological position is that I'm trying to think through this problem from the perspective of, if you want to call it Western, but scientific knowledge, right? So I want to explain spiritual ideas, mind, in such a way that I do not contradict the laws of physics and chemistry and the principles of biology. So I'm trying to synthesize these kinds of ideas. But I do recognize that this is only one angle, and it can be, I'm also aware of the limitations. But for what I want to explore, this is what I need to assume. And I think other assumptions would also be valid if you want to achieve something else. The second point is that I have written about this, but all of that and even my thoughts now are still very much explorative because this is a really hard problem. So I'm not declaring anything here. I'm exploring and suggesting some ideas and thoughts. I take Gregory Bateson's point about information and meaning and materiality as a point of departure, namely that any sign, any representative in Persian terms that we see is a difference that makes a difference. And I will explain that in a bit more detail later. I also take as a starting point Peirce's conceptualization that the meaning of a sign is its translation into another sign, and we've gone through this already. And then my own conceptualization of translation as negentropic semiotic work that we perform to constrain dynamic semiotic systems. By dynamic semiotic, I mean matter-energy semiotic systems for teleodynamic reasons, for some kind of goal that we might have. So in order to explain how mind and matter fit together, I think you need to make two arguments, two moves. The first is you need to explain how physical things, in other words, matter and energy, can have non-physical consequences. So just for a moment, think about you getting a letter typed which says dad passed away. In what way does the atoms in the ink make you sad? Because that's what happened. Yes, you have a constellation, a pattern of ink with atoms in them, right? But how the heck can those atoms make you sad? Create this feeling in you. Or you get an email saying from your lover, I'm coming home for the weekend. How does the pixels on a screen manage to create non-material effects like expectations? Now I'm excited. Now I'm looking forward to the weekend. And when I talk about non-material expectations, I do acknowledge that these expectations are materialized in our brains, but the expectation itself is a absential, abstract, non-material thing. So the first move that we have to argue is, how is it that physical things can have non-physical consequences? But then we have to turn this argument around and we have to say, how can non-physical things have physical consequences? So imagine the idea of social justice. There's nothing, there's nowhere in the world a material thing called social justice. Social justice is an idea brought together by many lines of thought, obviously, but it exists purely as an idea. But when we build courthouses, when we clothe judges, when we write down legal our laws and the pronouncements of courts, when we task a police force to take people into custody because they have transgressed this idea, we are turning the idea into something physical, or the idea, the non-physical thing, have physical consequences. And how does that happen? How can we explain that something that doesn't exist cause things to exist to change? The material things, right? How can we do that? So the first, or my suggestion would be that we need a synthesis between energy, information, and significance. And in that synthesis, hopefully these two moves will be covered. So, firstly, I need to explain how energy works. Energy is not a substance, right? A battery isn't energy. There is energy to be had from a battery, but the battery itself, a battery for your computer or whatever, isn't energy. There is energy when two physical states are in different levels of entropy, right? So if let's say the state of the battery is that one side of it is more positively, the atom's more positively charged, and on the other side negatively, then the difference between positive and negative creates energy. Now there can be flow so that the battery as a system becomes balanced again, becomes entropic again. And this difference can be harnessed for work, right? You can use this to do work, but energy itself doesn't exist as a substance. So just as a very practical example, imagine a bathtub, and it's plugged and it has 50 liters of water. So this water could do work, but at the moment it just lies quietly because everything is in equilibrium, right? The pressure from the air and the attraction from the bath itself are just sort of keeping everything in balance. But if you pull the plug, the difference in water pressure between the bath and the exit pipe allows the water to flow. Can't now get to this technical term. The way in which the earth attracts everything causes the water to flow. And now there is energy because there are two different states, material states, that work into one another. So the moment you pull the plug, the exit pipe allows the water to flow. And now there's energy, and if you would be smart enough, you could put a little turbine in there, which would be able to charge your cell phone. Right. So for anything to happen in our universe as far as we know it, you need these states of difference, material different states, and you harness the energy that those differences give you and afford you. And that is how we create energy and how we do things. For instance, with water, hydroelectricity. So I think information is a really interesting common ground between materiality and ideationality. Because like energy, information is not something. It is a relationship between two physical states. Right? Information is let's say, instantiated in a substance, but it is not the substance. And it is the relationship between these two different states. And this is where Bateson comes in. So Bateson says information is a difference, and this first difference is a physical difference. So information has to be in such a form that it stands out from its background. Writing on a whiteboard with white ink will give no information because there's no difference. It's all the same. You need white against black, or red against blue, or loud against soft to create differences, right? So information is a physical difference, which Bateson then says makes a difference. So makes a difference means it is meaningful, it is significant, it is relevant, it means something, it makes a difference to the organism observing it, right? So information is a physical difference that makes an ideational difference, if I can paraphrase in that way, which means that information is the effect of energy, because remember that first physical difference is a difference created by energy. So to create a difference between white and black, somebody or someone or something has to make a black mark on a white background, whether that be with a pen or just be with a thumb, or just the smoke of a fire that colors a white background in a different color. Doesn't matter, but information is the effect of energy. Terence Deacon then starts the synthesizing process by distinguishing three aspects of information, namely the syntax, the semantics, and the pragmatics of information. And this you can, those of you who have linguistic background, this is a typically linguistic understanding of information. So for Deacon, we have to say that what Claude Shannon, the famous information theorist, what he described as information is only the syntax of information. The carrying capacity that he wrote about, the entropy that happens in, let's say, a telephone call, that's only syntax. That's only about the materiality and the energy exchange that can take place. That in itself has no reference yet, and it has no meaning yet. It is only a physical, material process. The semantics of information, Deacon says, and he calls it Boltzmann information after, what was Boltzmann's name? I can't remember. He was a physicist, a thermodynamics theorist in the 1800s. Louis, I'm not sure. Anyway, he did a lot of work on thermodynamics, and he proved the case of material reference, where one system can be about another. So how is one system about another? It is to be seen in the energy difference between two systems. If two systems are adjacent, one is cold and one is hot, they reference one another. So the fact that you have a cold bathroom and you have hot water in the tub means that somehow something must have happened to heat that water. And that is what Boltzmann calls the referential function of material systems. One system references the other because one system has been brought about by the energy and energy differences with other material states. So this is then just, if you have the syntax, here you have a sign, you have let's say a sound. The semantics means that this sound must have made by something, it refers to something, and the pragmatics then, or what Deacon calls Darwinian information, is when in living organisms, the inside and the outside of the organism are coupled to be able to interpret Boltzmann information. So what happens is that living organisms evolve in such a way that they are able to observe and interpret the semantics, the differences in systems, the reference that's in that differences. They have the biological features of eyes and brains and nervous systems, for instance, or any other sensory organs that are coupled with the organism's biology and the outside, the environment's existence are coupled in such a way that it can be interpreted. We have seen was it Monday, that obviously you cannot interpret everything. There are always outside of your Umwelt, depending on what your species is, you cannot interpret everything. But at least there's some coupling that allows us to survive. So if you then synthesize this kind of matter-energy system with the Peircean semiotic system, you then have a representamen, which is the carrying capacity of a meaning, referring to an object, which is the reference based on the constraints in the representamen, and you get to an interpretant, which is then determining the relevance of the object through the representamen. So I don't have the object in front of me. I have some kind of just a representamen in front of me, but I'm able to link the representamen to some kind of object and then determine how and why is this relevant for me as a living organism. So with this, there's obviously much more to this argument and a lot of biology behind it. But I think from a humanities perspective, this is already probably not necessarily enough, but a good way forward in helping us to understand how the materiality of the representamen, and if the object is also material, because the object needn't be material, it could in cultural situations be ideational, but if to link the materiality of meaning making to the ideationality of meaning making. So that's that means then, and I've spoken about this during the 2 weeks, that information is always carried physically, but the information is not in the physicality. The information is in the relationship between the representamen, the object, and the interpretant. It's always relationally created. The constraints on the physicality, that conveys the possibility of information, that gives us the syntax or the form. The information then is always the relation between physical states internally to a living organism and externally. So those have to be related. Even in very high cultural and very abstract cultural situations like fictional novels, there is still this process going on. Firstly, the process of reading, the process of referring to states that are known materially, and so on. So interpretation, therefore, is always the process of selecting the physical features that are relevant to consider, picking them out first, and then once I've picked them out, what then are their relevance? And we've spoken about that on last Friday, I think. So that's the first move. That is a kind of a beginning to an explanation of how material things become mental things. And it is through the relation between a living organism and this material world that that are coupled, that are biologically coupled in such a way that materiality can be interpreted. The second move, I think, is actually the one that in the humanities we should be interested in, and which I think can be further refined. So let's just go back for the second move. In other words, how does mind constrain matter? How does mind have material consequences? So if we again say information is the difference, material energy difference that makes a difference, which Bateson says, it means that the first difference is material. The second difference is a absential difference, is a non-material difference. And if you want to read about absential, it's a term created by Terence Deacon in his 2013 book. You can read about that. So like energy, which is a relation between material systems, information is a relation between the difference between material systems, but then adding a third partner here, and that is the observer. So energy is a relation between two systems. Information is a relationship between three systems. Meaning making is a relationship between three systems, and this is where the body of the living organism comes in. Yes, I've said the significance is the relevance of these material differences for living organisms. So the big point, I think, to argue is how can significance itself become a constraint? Because if we said that energy requires constraints, and for any work you need energy, it means that, and energy is related to information, and information leads to significance. So all of these things connected. The core question here is, how does significance act as a constraint? So I think the first point that we need to understand is that the membrane, I'll explain this in a moment, and significance co-emerged. The membrane around a cell, I think, is one of the first points where a biological organism becomes differentiated from its material environment. Right? An atom is just part of its material environment. But within a cell, a metabolism is created within that cell, and the membrane becomes the contact point, the mediation point, the both similarity and difference point, the border, whatever you want to call it, between what has now become the internal part of the organism and the external part of the organism. And the moment you have an inside in a living organism, you have interest. Because now, within this membrane, it becomes important to have food, it becomes important to procreate, it becomes important to maintain the metabolism. So the moment you have a living organism separated from its environment by a membrane, significance becomes important, because certain things are now significant and certain things are not. For an atom, nothing is significant. It doesn't matter what it comes across in the next moment. If it will react with it, it will react with it. If it will bind with it, it will bind with it. If there's nothing, there's nothing. But the moment you have a membrane, you have interest. You have something that needs to survive. So we need to understand that significance and the biological formation of a membrane co-emerged and became important together, I think. So I've now explained where significance comes from, right? The moment you have a membrane, you have the potential for significance. But how does this significance itself becomes objectified or materialized? Because in physics terms, non-physical things cannot have an effect on physical things. If you ask a physicist, they will tell you that an absential thing cannot have an effect on a material thing. It's physically not possible. So What we need to argue is how ideas emerge from matter, but then also plays back into matter. And I think we start by saying that multicellular organisms, as I explained to you on Monday, have two sets of communicative abilities. So you have the endosemiosis between the cells or the organs, but you also have the communication with the environment through our sense organs and through our muscles and so on. So with this kind of communicative ability came further developments of nervous systems, central nervous systems, brain bodies that act together to perform, let's say, something like a language. So you have a complexification of this very basic membrane and significance that I spoke about in the beginning. In other words, the trend is that meaning-making processes moves from simple stimulus response to complex metacognition. And this is what we get then in a human organism. You have the human organism as a body and its cognitive subagent and the niche or the environment in which it lives. The body has organs which are made up of tissues, which are made up of cells, which are made up of molecular agents that can perform certain functions. But this body has particular organs that are able to perform cognitive acts, and they are called, in this model by Sharoff and Tennyson, they are called cognitive subagents. So you have perceptual agents like eyes and ears and noses. You have integrating subagents like nervous systems, brains, basically those two. And you have effector subagents, and that which are like your hands and your feet and your ability to create sounds through a vocal system and so on. So if we then say that the perceptual systems, the integrating systems, and the effector systems are integrated, it means that we perceive, think, and do with our bodies. And that is linked back into memory, from which we can draw at any stage. And all of this happens within a niche, which could be the natural environment. It could be artifacts, it could be information, and it could be social structures. And here you see these ideas like freedom and justice and peace, and structures like education and the economy, and so on. So when we think of translation and meaning making and the emergence of culture, we need to understand that this body with its functions and subagents is the place where meaning making happens. So to come to I think the solution of the problem, I think that language is our ability, or entails our ability as human beings, to objectify cognition. In my understanding, animals, for instance, would be able to think, to cognify, to think, but they cannot think about their thinking. And we can think about our thinking because we can put our thought into language, and then we can have the language as an object about which we can think. So what we do is with language, we get out of our own heads, if I can put it that way. We objectify, we turn our thoughts, our ideas into objects that we can talk about. With things like writing, audio recording, video recording, language then is objectified. So firstly, cognition is objectified in language, and then language itself can be objectified through various technological advances that we have, which means that we not only have our own thoughts, but we have the thoughts of others as objects to think about. And if we then say, well, cognition is distributed in the whole body and between bodies and in the environment, and that's the extended mind hypothesis, it means that we now have networks of objectified cognition, artifacts, practices, social structures. So my argument here is that ideas are able to constrain matter, even though ideas have no material existence of their own, but they exist within biological bodies which have been coupled with its environment to be able to act on ideas, right? To be able to objectify cognition, to objectify language, to objectify all our forms of cognition, and to download it into our environment in all kinds of practices that we can then act on, that have become objects in themselves. And I think with this line of argument, we can say that the biological body makes it possible for us to objectify significance and to have significance as a constraint on matter, because we can now say, because I think of the idea of peace, I can burn my gun, or I can put all my ammunition, I can blow it up and destroy it. So I think ideas, significances, social structures, metacognitions constrain brains to think, nervous systems. So the brains think, the brains constrain nervous systems, and nervous systems constrain muscles to operate in certain ways, and the muscles do things, make things material, change materiality, and all of this under the constraint of something that is actually absential, that is not material in itself. The significance which is objectified in brain chemistry and energy, muscle memory, artifacts, practices, social structures, and obviously in artificial intelligences can now constrain matter. And in this way, the essential, the material, and the absential, the immaterial, are actually woven into one cloth. And it is indeed true that I think human beings, although we do not completely live in a symbolosphere, but we are massively influenced by the absential. And the absential probably sometimes dominates the essential in all kinds of political, social engineering and all these kinds of things. So you can just take the example of the need for safety, which is an abstract concept. And you can materialize that by hiding in a cave every night. You can materialize that by building yourself a little shelter from wood. Or you can materialize it by building a stone or a brick house. Or if you in very cold areas, a house built out of ice, house built out of sand, whatever is available. So the idea can be materialized in a number of ways. So this, I think, leads us to what Michael Cronin suggested, I think in 2016 or somewhere, a trodosphere. So you would have matter and energy from which emerges life, from which emerges significance. And this significance becomes objectified and distributed. In other words, it becomes stuff that we can work on. And this objectified and distributed significance constrains matter. So we have a kind of a cycle that just keeps on. But obviously, it also works backwards, that matter energy can constrain objectified and distributed significance. This is the story of the boxer. I think it was Mike Tyson or Muhammad Ali or one of those. And they asked the person, this person was going into a massive fight, and they said, well, your opponent says they have a plan against you. They've worked out a plan. And then the boxer replied, well, everybody has a plan until the first time I hit them. And this is what happens here. You have objectified ideas. You think it constrains matter, but sometimes matter talks back so loudly that it punches you in the face, right? So we have a nice little cloud here of a troposphere that includes the physiosphere, the biosphere, and the semiospheres. Right. I quickly wanted to show you empirical example of research that I did in COVID. So at our university, this research was done not by me, so I'm using secondary data here. I didn't collect the data. It is a project called the Mediational Intervention for Sensitizing Caregivers. And this project was run in 2018. It's a project that aims at developing care in situations where children are in technical terms called at risk. This would mean in our context that the children are poor, that they sometimes have only one or no parents, that they have probably been abused emotionally and physically, raped, that they suffer sometimes from hunger, malnutrition. So it's children at risk. And the idea is that if these kids are housed in or can come to schools or have after school sessions with caregivers, and you can sensitize the caregivers, it will help the development of the children emotionally and cognitively. Right. So I thought this would be an interesting place to observe the interplay between matter, energy, and idea, mind, or culture on the other side. And hopefully it will become clear as I explain this. So what I had in front of me was 150 videos. 50, yes, I selected 100 to watch, but I had a total of 150. So what happened is the research team made 50 videos of interactions between caregivers and children before the training started. Then they did 50 videos after 6 months of training, and they did 50 videos after a year of training. So what I did, I watched all 50 at the baseline just to get an idea of what was going on. And then I randomly chose half of the 6 months interviews or recordings and half of the year recordings. All the interactions were in Sesotho, which is a local language in the area that I live. I understand basic Sesotho, but I cannot follow more intricate Sesotho. But that is not a problem. It's actually an advantage because I didn't want to listen to the language anyway. I wanted to look at the sound, listen to the sounds, and look at the bodies, and basically and listen to how much linguistic interaction there was rather than what was said, right? Because I wanted to see what the material and energy constraints and the cultural constraints, how they play out. So because these are children at risk, I didn't want to show screenshots. So I created a kind of a schema. So the two horizontal black lines are the chairs, represent the chairs on which the two participants sat. The two red lines represent their shoulder, their body position, whether they are turned to one another and to what extent they are turned to one another. The arrows, the yellow arrow is the teacher's head, and the grey arrow is the child's head. The dotted lines are their arms. The arrow square, rectangle, purple rectangle is the paper on which they worked, and the green triangle is the box of crayons that they can use. So what happened in all of these is that the caregiver gave the child a paper with a bowl of fruit, and then the child had to color the fruits and name the fruits, and they had a discussion about the fruits. So this is just a schema to represent that. So the general trajectory that I found that happened in most of the cases were as follows. The teacher always started the interview. The child never spoke first in not one of the 100 videos that I observed, which placed the initial sound comes from the teacher. The initial action comes from the teacher, which places the teacher in a particular position towards the child. The children also virtually never initiated any interaction. Not only no initiation or initiative when they started the interview, but there were only about 5 cases where the child would ask anything at all, where the child would say from their side, could you tell me this? Or could you explain this to me? Or I was at school today and this happened, right? So there was virtually no initiative from the children in verbally and in body language. In most cases, the teacher controlled the space on the table. Some of the teachers went so far as to point to a particular fruit on the paper and ask the child what it is, and then the child would say it's an apple or it's a this or a that, and then say color it, and then they choose the crayon and give it to the child to color, right? And they had this box of crayons on their side of the table. They controlled it, so they controlled the space on the table. In most cases, the children responded by monosyllabic verbal responses, or sometimes grunts. So they would just say, yes. Is this an apple? Yes. What color is it? Green. And sometimes they would just say, is this an apple? Or mm-mm. So there are very few full sentences being spoken by the children. Mostly the teacher instructs, do this, do that, or ask, what is this, what is that? There were cases where especially after a year of sensitizing and training, not teachers, caregivers, they're not teachers, sorry, caregivers, where they were able to engage with the children in a more informal way, but mostly they have this authoritarian position where they instruct and ask. And it was clear from the observations generally that there are little cognitive and even less emotional interaction. One or two outliers, though. So the question then is, so why? You can say, well, maybe it's an authoritarian culture, and in this culture, children are expected to listen and not to have opinions. You could say, well, they are at risk. They have been traumatized, and therefore they just are uncomfortable with other bodies. If you've been raped, another body is a serious threat. And you could argue, well, it's a teacher's lack of competence, which there are clear evidence of also. So from this general trajectory, I would then say, well, there's a propensity in terms of what Blumczynski said, things have conditioned things. Ideas have conditioned bodies. Bodies have conditioned ideas. So there are this propensity for little cognitive and emotional interaction to take place. So I want to show you, so my interest was not the interests of the people who did the initial research. They wrote up statistical and qualitative reports on how successful as a pedagogy, how successful this project was, and as a social developmental project. That was not my interest. My interest was, how does matter and mind interact? So you would have situations like this, where the paper is with the child is in control of the paper. The crayons are under the child's control. The teacher is turned towards the child, so the teacher is in her bodily, and they were all female, in her bodily position, she's turned towards the child. She tries to be open towards the child. The one I have here is with arms folded, but sometimes they would have their arms open. But still, the child is veering away. The child sits on the far edge of the chair with their shoulders turned away from the teacher, not looking at the teacher, just looking at the task at hand. Right? So material intent does not necessarily have effect in or immediate effect. There might, over a very long time, there might be a different effect. But when material things work on one another, you usually have similar effects. When cultural things, where matter and ideas are mixed, when they interact, the outcome isn't predictable. So what could happen here is that the teacher's body language and her attitude and her whole body is positive, but the child has either culturally or personally been traumatized to the point where that doesn't matter. The child still veers away. And then you have other examples that I saw where bodily both seem to have been tuned into one another. Here you can see the chairs are turned towards one another, the shoulders are turned, the gazes are focused on one another. They're sharing the paper. The teacher has a one hand on the paper. The teacher is open to the child. And still, in this example, the child doesn't respond except for monosyllabic answers. Right? So you cannot draw direct lines between what the teacher intends and what the child does, but you cannot also not draw direct lines between the bodily, the outward presentation of the child and what goes inside the heads. And this is, so the point is just, these things are complex to the point of being not understandable, some of them. So I've shown you this, but in this particular case, I could say that the main trajectory was 1.1 and 1.2.2, for instance, where nothing happened. Then you have some really early on already changes to that trajectory where the child would all of a sudden start asking questions, or sometimes at a later stage only, you would see some good interaction. Some of the later stages, you would see high fives, where the child feels comfortable to touch. There are cases where the children don't even want to hug the teacher after the caregiver after the interaction. Right. So to conclude, I think that if you assume the existence of language and culture, like we pretty much do in the humanities, we just assume that these things exist, you can only answer certain questions. I think the real hard work lies in explaining what is mostly assumed. to figure out what are the assumptions that influence our thought patterns, and that we investigate them, because usually we try to hide the difficult things through assumptions. And I think it's pretty normal. I don't think it's because we're evil or because we are bad. It's just you cannot argue everything at all the time. So you need to make assumptions, but we hide the difficult things in our assumptions. So I think neither materiality nor spirituality solves this hard problem. Because if you argue materially, the typical stuff of phenomenology is not only material. You need somehow, if you want to talk about human beings or living organisms even, and human culture, you need to be able to talk about absentials. I think spirituality doesn't solve the problem because we live through our bodies. And even if we are able to make contact with the deity, it's not an immediate contact, I think. It is a biosemiotically mediated contact. So we can't get out of the body, I think, either. Because, as I say, I think both matter and spirit are experienced biosemiotically. So I think translation studies in the next 10 or 20 years has a variety of issues to address. Obviously, the AI issue is really crucial and will ask many questions about not only how to translate, but what it means to be human and what it means to think and what it means to be creative. So it's clearly a burning issue. I think the ecological issue is another burning issue, how we fit our translational activities into an ecology, whether those activities be interlingual, intralingual, or intersemiotic. And I think the issue of cognition, neurosciences and thinking about how we think and how brains work and how brains and bodies are interacted is obviously, so I think cognitive studies and translation studies should be pretty important in the next few years. But for me, I think translation studies should spend at least some of his time trying to figure out, and we cannot do this alone, with other humanities and science scholars, how matter and mind fit together. Because it is a matter of translation. It is a matter of where do the things that we translate come from? How do they come to be in the first place? And as I suggested on Monday, I think that initial process of interacting with the material world is already a translational process. So I think I would hope that some scholars, I mean, some are definitely, but more scholars take up this challenge. Thank you very much for being patient and for sticking it out until the last. Obviously, if there are questions or comments or alternative viewpoints, I would appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Kobus. As per usual, a very thought-provoking lecture, and I think also a nice take-home message, sort of a fearlessness to revisit our own assumptions that we often hide behind, and trying to explain them. So it's something I think that we should all embrace. And your big question was, how does significance itself materialize and become objectified? So these are big, important questions. Thank you for leading the way in tackling them. I'm sure there are questions in the room. I was also, as people are thinking about their questions, by the way, Kobus, I hear feedback, so perhaps is your mic on?
Off.
It's off, okay. Maybe this is coming from another camera. Okay, wonderful. There's a question from Mel, but before we open to the floor, I was reminded. So it was quite interesting. The last study that you discussed, observations or videos that were produced in the context of another project. It seems like that would be it's kind of an interesting methodological move, and there's probably a lot of data out there. The first thing that came to mind was sort of there's a lot of research on pedestrians walking towards each other, and how or walking through a doorway, and how that interaction is something that's sort of it's this mutual anticipation. You could close your eyes and do the same thing, and you might see similar dynamics. And obviously, this dance that we have all done before is quite interesting. And also, the cultural conventions of passing each other are also specific to different cultures and so on. So it was an inspirational thought just to think, okay, what's out there in terms of data that already exists, and how could we revisit it from this perspective. All right, so Maud, let's open the questions with you. Please go ahead.
Hello, Cobus, thank you very much. Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not sure it's really a question. It was just something I was thinking about when you described your study, the study that Jack just mentioned. And I was wondering, because you said that you don't speak Sesotho, and that it was not so important because it was not what you wanted to see. You wanted to see bodily movements. I was wondering if this kind of study can be applied also, if people apply, I'm sure they do, I don't know that kind of study, but do that to understand, to study and describe interpreters at work in certain settings. And in this case, how can you look at the same time at body movements and interlingual translation? There are like various kind of translation at work at the same time. And or would they relate to each other, and even more difficult if it's about sign language interpreting? So I'm not sure it's really a question, but it was just methodologically, it's quite it seems quite difficult to look at both at the same time. Why I think that it's very important to do so. Do you have any experience on that or thoughts? Well, so it's not really a question, right?
Yeah, no. I think it's important. I think methodologically, a semiotic approach to translation studies means that you don't have to exclude language, but you could if you wanted to, right? So you could choose for a particular study just to observe the body language of interpreters, right? How they move around, when they scratch their heads, right? You could also choose to compare that to the verbal rendition. So you could say, okay, let me see if there are, for instance, if they, each time that there's a problem, they scratch their head. If each time they run into a cognitive difficulty, they move around in their chairs. And what would that contribute? So there's a famous book from the 1930s, The Anthropology of Jest and Rhythm, by a French linguistic anthropologist, Marcel Jousse. And he would analyze in quite detail how bodily movements are linked to thought processes. For instance, a child having to repeat a poem in class, a 9-year-old, they would typically sway when they do the poem, and quite often the teachers tell them to stand still, but then they can't remember, because the movement of the body is a cognitive function, or an extensive cognitive function to help you remember and to help you place yourself and where you are in the poem now. So I don't have much experience except for this little study that I did, but I do think you would be methodologically justified to either look at just the intersemiotic, just the interlinguistic, or a combination of both. And I think the combinations probably are the most difficult. In terms of how to do it, I think the presentation we saw yesterday, and I can't now remember who it was who used Elan, is a very nice tool for a kind of a conversational analysis where you are able to transcribe, and there are methods that you do that, how you transcribe the verbal, the gaze, the tone, the turn taking, etc., etc. And you can use that multiple layered software that Elan offers you, where you can basically transcribe 6 or 7 modes of meaning, one below the other. Yeah, it was probably Carolina. So that because it is really, it becomes complex. The problem is that it is so labor intensive, and I'm not sure whether there are AI systems that can help with these visuals at the moment. But it's really labor intensive. So analyzing a 5-minute interpreting session will be a significant lot of work. But yes, that is being, so there's a it's basically borrowing from conversational analysis and adding some of our intersemiotic translation ideas to it.
Thank you very much. Because I was also thinking that if we have an interpreter, for instance, interpreting in 2 or more languages, there will be various cultural constraints, maybe linked to the different languages. So it's another layer. And well, but I find it fascinating. But as you said, also time consuming, of course.
Yeah. And what one would just need to keep in mind is that this kind of work, I don't think you can ever simplify it. So there would be cultural differences, but there would also be personality differences. So some of us talk with our hands, some of us don't. But then also hand gestures are become cultural modes of one of the cultures, I don't know who it is, that's no, you know, they have this very specific finger when they tell you no. In our culture, that would be actually quite a bit aggressive, while in this culture, I can't remember whether it's just, no, I don't know, you know, but this little finger thing. So one has to be think about the complexity of the modes that you are working with. Yeah.
I had a question about the cognitive objectification of language, so in our thoughts. I have 2 thoughts on that, really. What would happen if you can't find the words for your thoughts or your feelings? And also, would you consider our linguistic repertoire to be kind of a framework for our thoughts then? But it can go 2 ways. It can either be very liberating, but it can also be kind of a cage in a way that we can only conceptualize or objectify our thoughts because we have the words for it.
Yeah.
It's an idea.
Yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. For me, it kind of goes without saying, and that's why I didn't focus on it. But the kind of logic that I used would be, let's say, the first time to objectify knowledge would happen like this. But obviously, we now are born into cultures and into linguistic systems, and therefore, as much as we create the framework creates us, right, and constrains us. So definitely, and I think all theories of linguistic relativism and have already made this very clear, that when I grow up within a particular language group, I have a particular experience of the world. The interesting point here, and this is very scary stuff, is to what extent. Okay, let me just take it the other way around. There are now theories in biology that defines species not only in terms of their genes or their shared features, but in terms of their communicative compatibility. So a species is a group of things that can communicate in such a way to find a mate and to reproduce. There is this line of thought. And I asked a biologist once, so does that mean that different cultures are actually different species, because you typically find your mate within your culture because you can communicate with them? And the biologist was not really keen to answer the question. But this, I'm raising this just again to problematize the relationship between our biology and our cultural ideas, and to say that, again, it's an assumption. There are certain assumptions, right? I don't think that different cultures means that we are different species, because you see quite often that people fall in love across, and even with people that they have very little verbally in common with, right? So I think there's more to it. But anyway, that's just to talk about these frameworks, which are cultural and biological, and sometimes biocultural, if you can put it that way. And I also know this is seriously dangerous stuff when it comes to eugenics and racism and all these kinds of things. What happens to your thoughts if you can't find the words? Typically, you will translate them. You will say, you will take an unidentified thought and try and relate it to a concept that you know, that you have a word for, right? So you would say, I feel bluish, right? Without being able to say exactly how you feel. If you cannot do that, I assume that the experience will just disappear. It might be stored in your memory, and a year later you might have the same experience, and then you've learned a word for it, right? So that might happen. But it might also be not important enough to be stored in your long-term memory, and then it's just gone. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have other questions. Or are they gone as well? I have another question, if I may. It relates to AI, which has come up a few times. But today, I mean, the next generation of AI is what has been called agental AI, which is AI systems that can work autonomously as independent agents. What is the label that you would put on that type of an agent in the context of objectified cognition? Do you see AI as a sort of so in other words, is there such a thing as objectified cognition that exists beyond or outside of biological systems? And is AI for you sort of an advanced form of objectified cognition, in the sense that we've created a system that allows us to it's uploaded all kinds of information and objectified cognition, in a sense, in a very complex way that has a sort of a gentle ability to create meaning itself. What are your reflections on that form of of meaning making outside of the biological?
Let me just because I know virtually nothing about computation and coding and these kinds of things, I'm really hesitant to talk about AI. If I have to try and think logically about it from a biosemiotic perspective, I would say yes, computers are tools that humans created to extend their cognitive capability. I mean, computers can do calculations at speeds that humans just cannot do. And that AI is a further development of that, downloading our cognitive tasks onto our reality. And the more we can do that and the faster we can do that, obviously that has that holds advantages. But it becomes really murky is when you have claims that AI is intelligent and will think on its own, or will think independently from how it's been programmed. You have the question that if you can have intelligence in carbon-based organisms, why can't you have intelligence in silicon-based? Well, they're definitely not organisms. So there's biosemiotically speaking, that's a major difference. There's a major difference between an organism and a machine. A machine cannot maintain itself. An organism maintains itself actually over generations, but machines cannot maintain themselves. Machines do not reproduce. But sure, these things seem to be becoming cognitively independent. And that for me is difficult to comment on. Whether we are creating real semiotic agents. From what I understand and what I see, I don't think we are there. I think it's claims. But then, as I said, my understanding is really limited, so I might be completely wrong. At this point, my understanding is that, yes, AI significantly mimics thinking, and it can think within certain parameters. But the biosemiotic definition of thinking and cognizing, I don't think it's there yet, but I might be wrong. Yeah. If there are no further questions, I want to try and show you a nice example of a complex system. A little demonstration. Can I do that? If people want to leave, they're welcome to leave. If they don't want to see this, I just want to get it now. Sorry, I need to quickly look for it. No. If there are questions in the meantime, you're welcome to ask. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. And then I'm just going to play this as an example of a complex system. Not really. So there's complete chaos in the system now. And then order appears. And chaos. Whoops. What did I do wrong now? Okay. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You can just want to stop share. So this thing plays for about 5 minutes, and it shows how, without anybody organizing it, the constraints under which these balls operate just and this is just physical constraints being controlled by physical constraints, how order and chaos follow each other kind of randomly. Yeah, and that is a typical, imagine a translation process where you read a text and you create a translation as this, where there is disorder, order, disorder, order, just for interest sake. With that, yeah, then if there are no questions, then we're done.
I think it's a lovely image to end on. So thank you very much, Professor Maré, for again a very thought-provoking 5th lecture. And for the record, all of the recordings from the lectures will be published on the YouTube channel for etc. to revisit as many times as necessary. And please join me, everyone, in thanking Cobus for a wonderful lecture series. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It's a great honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cobus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lots of love in the room. So our next session picks up at 11, so in a bit over a half hour, and this is the Q&A with Diana Roy-Sans, and then we'll turn back to the participant panels this afternoon. Panel 5 will not be 2 hours, but an hour and a half, so gain a little space there. And then we'll end the day today at 5:30 with a Q&A about the Cetra book series and our editorial mentoring program. So a busy day, and there are also tutorials happening. So we'll see you at 11. Thank you, everyone.